If you went back to the Permian period, what would you find? It would be an ancient era, full of life but also of death. The Permian was the stage for the greatest mass extinction event in Earth's history, even more severe than the one that wiped out the dinosaurs. Almost all life was extinguished. The Permian period lasted for nearly 50 million years, from 299 million years ago to 252 million years ago. It can be divided into three stages: the early Permian, the middle Permian, and the late Permian. We will guide you through each of them. Obviously, we'll start with the early Permian. In this era, some of the earliest tetrapods began to emerge. These animals are now extinct, but they were the ancestors of dinosaurs and later of mammals. These enormous predators are definitely not something you would want to get close to. On land, the apex predator was a synapsid. These animals dominated the land before the appearance of dinosaurs. They're often called mammal-like reptiles because they looked like a mix of a dog and a lizard. They had extremely thick skin, which allowed them to retain a lot of water, which made them thrive in an increasingly dry environment. The most famous synapsid is the Dimetrodon. You certainly would not want to meet it. At over 3.5 meters long, it was a fierce carnivorous creature with a huge sail on its back. Being cold-blooded, it needed some way to regulate its body temperature, and perhaps this sail-like structure served that function, helping the Dimetrodon to warm up or cool down at different temperatures. These giant beasts were also equipped with a terrifying mouth full of teeth of various sizes. Another animal you would need to watch out for was the Gorgonopsid. These carnivores had enormous saber teeth, and their image was quite similar to that of today's Siberian tiger. Some scientists describe them as the T-Rex of that era. They were fearsome predators capable of destroying any creature that stood in their way. Their favorite meal was the Dicynodont. The name means two saber teeth, but fortunately, if you met them, you wouldn't have to be afraid as they might end up being your lunch. These synapsids were herbivores and varied in size, from as small as a pet dog to as large as a cow. Dicynodons looked like a mixture of mammals, reptiles, and birds. They had a turtle-like skull, a bird-like beak, and even tusks that they used to dig for food. In the Permian period, Dicynodonts were cold-blooded, but in the Triassic that followed, some species evolved more mammal-like features, helping them to stay warm. Surprisingly, these creatures managed to survive the catastrophe that was to come. And if they had become extinct, humanity might not have evolved. We'll come back to other Permian creatures later, but for now, let's take a look at the place where they lived. In this period, if you were looking at the Earth from space, you would see that all the land masses were joined into one supercontinent, which was called Pangaea. It was formed when two large continents, Gondwana and Laurasia, collided. The formation of this supercontinent had a huge impact on the climate. But before we talk about the climate, let's look at the location of today's continents within this supercontinent. Pangaea looked like a giant crescent moon. The top of the crescent moon would later split to form Europe and Asia. The main body of the crescent moon contained what is today North America, South America, and Africa. The bottom of the crescent moon would later separate to form India, Antarctica, and Australia. The crescent moon enclosed a sea called the Tethys Ocean, and the rest of the Earth was a vast body of water, the Panthalassa Ocean. So far, so good. Although you wouldn't have 7 continents to choose from to live on, you could camp anywhere on Pangaea. Maybe you would like to find a place by the sea. However, the big question is whether you would freeze to death or get scorched, and that would depend on the time and place you arrived. In the early Permian, the Earth was actually in an ice age. If you were in the southern region of Pangaea, you would find an abundance of glaciers. Tons and tons of glaciers, to be exact. These glaciers were spread across what is now South India, Australia, and Antarctica. Due to this enormous continent, the weather would be very different from what you are familiar with today.
In our world today, the oceans are great at absorbing heat. They warm up and cool down slowly, influencing the temperature on land. But on this supercontinent, the interior was far from the water, so this area experienced more extreme temperature changes. In the middle Permian, you would enjoy a warm, humid climate. The glaciers had retreated and the interior of Pangaea became arid. According to the Pangaean monsoon system theory, there would be extreme seasonal fluctuations throughout the year, with alternating wet and dry seasons. As temperatures continued to rise, the late Permian would become very dry, with some alternations of warm and cool periods. What about the oxygen in the atmosphere? Would it be enough for you to survive? In the early Permian, the oxygen concentration was actually quite high, reaching 30%. This was because in the previous period, the Carboniferous forests covered the Earth, creating an oxygen-rich environment. You might like the extra oxygen supply, feeling more energetic. And if you lived in mountainous areas, you would feel more comfortable, as the thin air would be offset by the higher oxygen concentration. However, although oxygen is good, breathing this concentration for a long period would be harmful. Over time, you could develop oxygen toxicity, leading to breathing difficulties and, in severe cases, seizures and death. But the high oxygen levels did not last throughout the Permian. By the end, the oxygen concentration dropped drastically. Before that, you might be wondering what there would be to eat. As temperatures rose during the Permian, plants began to flourish. But the edible options for you would be limited. In the early Permian, polar ice caps and tropical swamp forests coexisted. However, as the climate became drier, the swamp forests gradually disappeared, and plants that liked moisture shrank into shrubs. Therefore, unless you had the teeth and stomach of a cow, chewing on these dry shrubs would not be much fun. Unfortunately, these shrubs did not produce fruits or berries. They only truly evolved in the Jurassic, so you would probably run the risk of getting scurvy. But there was one plant that was abundant: ferns. Ferns were the dominant plant type of the time. Maybe you could eat some young fern fronds or make some tea from tree bark. It wouldn't be a hamburger, but it would do. Some plants could also be dangerous. Since you wouldn't be used to them, they could trigger some fatal allergic reaction. But nasty plants would not be your only food source. Why not try nasty insects? During this period, insects found a place to live. During the Permian, species of insects with sucking mouthparts appeared. You would also see giant dragonflies flying around. Maybe you could try to catch one. We don't know if it would taste like chicken. You would also notice that these insects were huge. In the early Permian, large insects from the Carboniferous period still existed. In the middle Permian, these giant insects disappeared, leaving behind some smaller insects that still exist today. However, roasting a Dicynodont herbivore would be a good idea. It wouldn't be a spicy chicken burger, but it might fill your stomach. In the Permian, there was also a creature called Volcanops, a small lizard-like animal that fed mainly on insects. Another important group of creatures during the Permian were the Sauropsids. They were basically reptiles. During the Permian, Synopsids dominated, while Sauropsids remained small and lizard-like. However, they would make a glorious return in their later evolution. And what about catching fish? Maybe you could try some fish dishes. The Permian oceans were full of bony fish. These fish had two features: delicate fins and thick scales. In the seas, there was also a creature called an ammonite. Their shells coiled in a spiral. While not the perfect lobster, perhaps a seafood meal would be your best option. However, if you went swimming in the sea, you would have to be careful. You would need to stay away from the terrible arctops, a lizard-like creature that had deadly tusks and a 2-meter-long skull. This creature was much bigger than you, at 2.5 meters long, and could open its mouth to suck in prey. But the good news is that it was slow, so if you were a good swimmer, you might be able to escape. However, not all creatures thrived in this period. In the late Permian, you would find that things were changing.
Life on Earth was undergoing a mass extinction. It was the largest species extinction event on Earth, with 90% of marine life and 70% of land animals and plants disappearing. To this day, scientists are still not entirely sure what caused the Great Extinction, but there are several theories. A major one is that a series of natural disasters may have been the cause. Volcanoes. In the late Permian, in what is now the Siberian region, a large-scale volcanic eruption occurred. It wasn't an eruption of years or decades, but it lasted for about 600,000 years. A large amount of lava flooded the region. However, it was not the lava that caused the extinction, but the gases that the volcanoes released, especially sulfur dioxide. These gases entered the atmosphere, causing acid rain. Volcanic ash was also ejected into the air, blocking out the sun, plunging the Earth into darkness, and causing temperatures to drop. The result was that plants had difficulty performing photosynthesis. The food chain was broken, and after the plants were extinct, the herbivores were extinct, and finally, the carnivores were also extinct. It was like a row of dominoes falling, one after the other. But it wasn't just the breakdown of the food chain. Breathing also became increasingly difficult as the extinction of plants had a major impact on the atmosphere. With the interruption of photosynthesis, carbon dioxide concentrations rose, while oxygen levels dropped to 16%. Animals that had evolved in an oxygen-rich environment could not adapt to this sudden drop in oxygen and were extinct. If you were alive at that time, you would feel like you were climbing to the top of the world's highest mountain today, where breathing becomes extremely difficult. Just climbing up a little would leave them breathless. At the same time, the increase in carbon dioxide also caused the greenhouse effect. The temperature rose and the ocean warmed. This in turn led to the death of many marine creatures. The rising temperature combined with the decrease in oxygen created an extremely hostile world for all life where survival was almost impossible. But there is a third theory. Originally, scientists estimated that the mass extinction occurred over millions of years, but more recent archaeological evidence suggests that the extinction event may have happened more quickly, perhaps between 80,000 and 100,000 years. Were there other factors that led to the sudden extinction of these creatures? Yes, some scientists believe there was another culprit, an asteroid. In addition to the volcanic eruptions, scientists have also found evidence of an asteroid impact. The asteroid may have been 6 to 12 kilometers wide, larger than Mount Everest. So, perhaps it was the combination of these factors, volcanic eruptions, the climate impact, and a huge asteroid, that became the final straw for life on Earth. The combination of the three created the largest species extinction event on Earth. However, not all creatures were extinct. Some managed to survive. Dicynodonts later evolved into mammal-like creatures and lived alongside the dinosaurs. Although they were not the top predators, it was better to live than to be extinct. They even lived longer than the dinosaurs and eventually evolved into today's mammals. Small sharks migrated to the deep sea, avoiding the acidic coastal waters. They still exist today. Sauropsid reptiles also survived. The small lizards had an advantage in the competition for survival. Compared to the large synapsids, their small stature, cold-bloodedness, and slowness gave them a better chance of survival. In the Triassic and Jurassic that followed, they evolved into the powerful dinosaurs. It was once thought that most trees also disappeared in the mass extinction, but scientists continue to find species of plants that survived. Whether in microorganisms, plants, or animals, life always finds a way to survive.